There are mornings that arrive softly, almost invisibly, carrying nothing more than sunlight across kitchen counters and the distant sound of birds moving through mountain air. Then there are mornings that become frozen in memory forever. Entree. May 10, 2020, Suzanne Morphew disappeared during what should have been an ordinary bike ride near her home in Colorado. No screams were heard, no witnesses stepped forward, only silence remained afterward. At first, the case looked deceptively simple. A middle-aged woman went missing in a rural area surrounded by rough terrain and thick stretches of wilderness. Investigators initially considered the possibility of an accident or an animal encounter. Yet the deeper authorities looked, the stranger the disappearance became. There were no clear signs of struggle, no reliable timeline, and no explanation capable of closing the growing emptiness surrounding Suzanne Morphew's final known movements. Cases like this create a different kind of fear because they attack the illusion of predictability. Most people believe danger announces itself loudly. They imagine violence as chaotic and obvious, but some crimes emerge quietly from familiar spaces: a driveway, a kitchen, a marriage. The unsettling question hanging over this case was not simply what happened to Suzanne, but whether the threat had already been living beside her long before she disappeared. Before we continue deeper into this story, take a moment to support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. These cases are not simply stories meant for entertainment. They are fragments of real lives, real grief, and unanswered questions that still linger years later. Every investigation carries hidden layers beneath the headlines, and sometimes the quietest details reveal the darkest truths hidden inside ordinary human behavior and relationships. Maysville, Colorado, looked like the kind of place where nothing truly terrible could happen. Nestled near the Rocky Mountains, the community was small, scenic, and isolated enough to feel protected from the noise of larger cities. Roads curved around forests and open land. Neighbors recognized familiar vehicles. People waved at each other in passing. The landscape itself created the illusion of peace, as though nature could somehow shield residents from human darkness and private suffering. To outsiders, the Morphew family seemed to represent the ideal image of stability, success, and domestic peace. Suzanne and Barry had spent decades building a life together while raising two daughters in the quiet mountains of Colorado. Their secluded home, surrounded by forests and distance from urban pressure, projected comfort, privacy, and the appearance of a family untouched by emotional turmoil or hidden conflict. Yet appearances often hide realities that outsiders never notice. Criminal investigators frequently encounter families who seem emotionally stable, while tension quietly grows beneath. Routine life. Human beings are remarkably skilled at protecting social images during periods of internal collapse. Sometimes the stronger the pressure becomes, the harder people work to imitate normality and emotional balance. The morning Suzanne disappeared seemed painfully ordinary. Neighbors reported no disturbances, arguments, or visible signs of conflict. The weather remained calm, and the community moved through its routines without concern. That absence of warning later became deeply unsettling. Investigators struggled with how completely normal everything appeared before Suzanne suddenly vanished from the visible world around her. Friends often described Suzanne as warm, sociable, and devoted to her family. She maintained close relationships and invested deeply in the people around her. After surviving cancer, she carried herself with resilience shaped by hardship and gratitude. Those who knew Suzanne rarely considered her impulsive or reckless. Her personality suggested emotional stability rather than voluntary disappearance or sudden abandonment. That behavioral consistency mattered greatly during the investigation. In missing person cases, established routines often reveal more than physical evidence during the earliest stages. Suzanne maintained regular communication with loved ones and remained strongly connected to family life. When someone suddenly breaks deeply rooted habits without explanation, investigators begin considering coercion, manipulation, or hidden conflict occurring behind closed doors. Barry Morphew quickly became a central figure in public discussion surrounding the case. As Suzanne's husband, his statements and behavior naturally attracted scrutiny from investigators and online audiences alike. Barry appeared calm and controlled during early public appearances. However, over time, inconsistencies within his timeline and explanations gradually intensified suspicion surrounding the couple's final days together. Public reactions toward grieving spouses are often driven more by emotional expectation than psychological reality. Many people believe trauma should appear dramatic, visible, and immediate. However, grief affects individuals differently. Investigators rarely judge emotion alone. Instead, concern usually increases when timelines shift repeatedly, explanations evolve under pressure, or behavior begins appearing overly rehearsed, controlled, and emotionally disconnected. The Morphew daughters remained trapped inside the emotional center of the investigation. Although they did not directly witness Suzanne's disappearance, they reflected the family atmosphere investigators tried to understand. Children living within fractured households frequently sense tension, long before outsiders notice it. Silence itself can quietly communicate fear, resentment, emotional distance, and denial. As media attention intensified, neighbors and acquaintances began revisiting old memories through a darker psychological lens. Some recalled tension between Suzanne and Barry. Others mentioned subtle controlling behavior or emotional coldness. Human beings naturally reinterpret past interactions after tragedy occurs, searching ordinary moments for hidden warning signs they once dismissed or failed to recognize. What disturbed many investigators was the environment surrounding the case itself. Communities like Maysville are built upon familiarity, routine, and trust. Violent crime feels emotionally incompatible with places that appear peaceful. Yet criminologists understand isolation can conceal dysfunction effectively. Privacy limits. Accountability, allowing emotional instability inside households to deepen quietly over long periods without interruption. Psychological deterioration inside relationships rarely appears suddenly. Financial stress, illness, emotional disconnection, and unresolved resentment often build gradually beneath daily routines. Violence usually develops through accumulated frustration and damaged control, rather than one explosive event alone. The greatest danger lies in normalization, because people slowly adapt to unhealthy environments until instability begins feeling emotionally ordinary. As investigators searched forests and roads surrounding the Morphew property, one reality became impossible to ignore. Suzanne had vanished from a life that appeared stable while concealing deeper emotional fractures underneath. Whether the truth involved accident, stranger violence, or someone closer remained uncertain. Yet one principle lingered quietly beneath every theory: no secret stays buried forever. By the morning of May 10, 2020, Suzanne Morphew was already moving through the final ordinary hours anyone would ever associate with her life. The day carried no obvious warning signs. Nothing visible suggested that investigators, journalists, and online communities would later spend years reconstructing these moments frame by frame, searching desperately for clarity hidden somewhere inside silence and routine. Suzanne reportedly exchanged messages during the early hours of that Sunday. Some communications appeared casual, while others hinted at emotional strain beneath the surface. Digital conversations often reveal psychological fragments people fail to express aloud. In many criminal investigations, phones become emotional diaries. Tiny pauses, deleted messages, and disrupted patterns can expose conflict long before physical evidence begins revealing anything meaningful to authorities or families. Her planned bike ride initially seemed insignificant. Suzanne was known for spending time outdoors, and the surrounding Colorado landscape encouraged routines connected to hiking, cycling, and isolation in nature. Yet investigators later struggled to establish a completely reliable timeline regarding exactly when she left home, which route she intended to follow, and whether her movements that morning aligned with her normal behavioral habits and personal routines. Behavioral analysts pay close attention to disrupted routine because predictability anchors most human behavior. People unconsciously repeat familiar sequences every day, especially in stable domestic environments. When those patterns suddenly fracture, investigators search for pressure points. Was Suzanne distracted emotionally? Did she alter plans voluntarily? Or had something already occurred inside the household before she ever stepped onto the road with her bicycle that Sunday morning in Colorado? As the hours passed, Suzanne's phone activity reportedly decreased sharply. Communications stopped. Digital silence settled in unexpectedly. Modern investigations often depend heavily on electronic footprints because complete disappearance has become increasingly rare in contemporary life. Phones move, devices connect, people leave traces everywhere. When communication suddenly ends without explanation, investigators begin asking whether the silence reflects choice, panic, physical incapacity, or deliberate interference by another person entirely during critical moments. At some point during that day, Suzanne Morphew disappeared completely. No verified witness publicly confirmed seeing her during the exact moment she vanished. This absence became psychologically disturbing because humans instinctively seek narrative structure around tragedy. People want beginnings, middles, and endings. But unresolved disappearances deny that comfort. Instead of a visible event, investigators confronted an invisible transition between existence and absence, leaving only fragments scattered across disconnected timelines and uncertain recollections. Later, Suzanne's bicycle was discovered abandoned near a roadside area in Chaffee County. The image itself carried unsettling symbolism. A bicycle usually represents movement, health, and independence. Seeing it discarded without explanation transformed an ordinary object into evidence loaded with emotional weight. Yet the scene offered remarkably little clarity. Investigators reportedly found no obvious signs of a violent crash, no blood, and no direct indication of what actually interrupted her ride. The absence of physical evidence complicated every possible explanation surrounding Suzanne Morphew's disappearance. If she suffered an accident, why were there so few signs supporting that conclusion? If another person was involved, where were the indicators of confrontation? Investigators struggled because uncertainty itself creates psychological tension, often more disturbing than confirmed truth surrounding violent crime. Search teams moved quickly across the rugged wilderness surrounding the Morphew property. Investigators, volunteers, rescue crews, and tracking dogs searched forests, steep trails, and isolated terrain throughout Colorado. The landscape's beauty soon felt emotionally oppressive. Vast open spaces create dangerous investigative conditions because physical disappearance can happen rapidly, while emotional certainty disappears even faster afterward. Concern inside Suzanne's family intensified once she failed to return home or maintain communication. Missing person investigations often begin with harmless assumptions because loved ones instinctively search for reassuring explanations first. Yet Suzanne's silence quickly felt unnatural. When familiar communication patterns suddenly stop without warning, anxiety transforms into something deeper, instinctive, and psychologically difficult to dismiss or rationalize away. As media attention expanded nationally, Barry Morphew publicly pleaded for Suzanne's return. His demeanor appeared controlled and composed, but public opinion divided quickly afterward. In true crime cases, audiences often judge grief through unrealistic emotional expectations. Although trauma affects everyone differently, some observers viewed Barry's calm behavior as unusual, causing suspicion to quietly intensify around his public appearances. Investigators reportedly observed that parts of Barry Morphew's timeline shifted as questioning became more detailed. Minor inconsistencies are not unusual during stressful situations because memory often weakens under emotional pressure. However, repeated revisions tend to attract psychological suspicion. Truth usually remains relatively stable over time, while deceptive narratives frequently require ongoing adjustment as evidence, witness accounts, and investigative scrutiny continue evolving throughout the case. Public suspicion also intensified because people instinctively search for familiarity when confronting violent uncertainty. Statistically, victims are more often harmed by someone already inside their personal lives rather than random strangers. Once inconsistencies appeared within Barry's statements, public attention slowly shifted away from the wilderness itself and toward the emotional reality hidden inside the Morphew marriage. Behind closed doors, relationships can quietly deteriorate, for years without attracting outside concern. Emotional distance rarely begins with dramatic conflict. Instead, resentment, disappointment, control issues, and frustration accumulate gradually beneath daily routines. Criminal psychologists understand that prolonged emotional strain subtly reshapes behavior over time, while outsiders continue believing everything inside the household remains stable and emotionally healthy. Investigators later uncovered surveillance, gaps and unusual inconsistencies within certain digital records connected to Suzanne's disappearance. These irregularities did not immediately prove criminal involvement, but they intensified investigative pressure. Technology typically clarifies movement and timelines. When digital evidence instead creates confusion, authorities begin considering coincidence, manipulation, system malfunction, or carefully planned human interference during critical moments. Suzanne's phone activity and communications also appeared to stop suddenly, rather than fading naturally throughout the day. That abrupt silence disturbed investigators psychologically because people instinctively maintain connection during ordinary travel and movement. Sudden disappearance from digital communication often suggests interruption. Whether caused by fear, force, or unexpected crisis, the pattern strongly conflicted with Suzanne's established personal habits. By this point, the investigation had evolved into something psychologically heavier than a missing persons case. Every inconsistency generated new suspicion, while every unanswered question deepened uncertainty further. Suzanne Morphew seemed to vanish into silence itself, and when investigators finally turned powerful lights onto the case, the darkness surrounding it only appeared to grow deeper and more unsettling. As the days turned into weeks, investigators widened the search far beyond the immediate area surrounding Suzanne Morphew's home. Teams moved through forests, ravines, and isolated terrain where visibility disappeared quickly beneath dense vegetation and uneven ground. Colorado's landscape complicated everything. Nature concealed evidence efficiently, while time slowly erased fragile traces. Investigators desperately needed to reconstruct Suzanne's final movements and circumstances. Search operations initially focused heavily on the possibility of an outdoor accident. Investigators examined trails, waterways, and steep sections of wilderness where a cyclist might disappear unnoticed. Yet the absence of convincing physical evidence gradually weakened that explanation. There were too many unanswered questions and too few environmental indicators. Even experienced investigators began sensing that Suzanne's disappearance involved something psychologically and behaviorally more complex than misfortune alone. One difficulty in early investigations involves cognitive bias. When authorities first approach a case, initial assumptions often shape which details receive attention and which become unintentionally minimized. Some potential clues connected to Suzanne's movements reportedly received limited focus during the earliest stages. In criminal psychology, delayed recognition can permanently damage investigations because fragile evidence deteriorates long before investigators fully understand its significance or broader contextual meaning. Forensic evidence also failed to provide immediate clarity. Investigators lacked a definitive crime scene, a body, or obvious biological evidence directly identifying what happened. This created an investigative vacuum filled increasingly by interpretation rather than certainty. Cases without physical resolution become psychologically dangerous because human beings instinctively attempt to fill missing spaces with theories, assumptions, emotional reactions, and personal bias shaped by fear and incomplete information surrounding unresolved trauma. Meanwhile, national media attention expanded rapidly. Suzanne Morphew's disappearance moved beyond Colorado and entered the wider true crime landscape across television, online forums, and social media communities. Public fascination intensified because the case combined several emotionally powerful elements: a missing mother, a seemingly perfect family, isolated geography, and growing suspicion surrounding those closest to her. The mystery invited endless speculation precisely because certainty remained painfully absent throughout the investigation. Social media transformed Suzanne Morphew's disappearance into something far larger than a traditional criminal investigation. Thousands of strangers analyzed interviews, timelines, and family photographs, searching for hidden meaning. Online audiences increasingly acted like amateur profilers, projecting theories onto limited information. Some observations appeared reasonable, while others reflected paranoia, emotional projection, or entertainment disguised as analysis. Barry Morphew soon became the center of growing public pressure. Investigators reportedly examined inconsistencies within his statements, movements, and explanations regarding Suzanne's disappearance. Public attention focused heavily on his demeanor, searching for signs of deception beneath controlled behavior. Criminal psychologists warn against oversimplifying grief, yet repeated inconsistencies often attract more suspicion than visible emotional reactions themselves. Statistically, investigators understand that intimate partners frequently become primary suspects in disappearances involving adult women. That reality influenced both public perception and investigative focus surrounding Barry Morphew. Authorities reportedly explored possible motives involving marital strain, emotional control, financial stress, and declining trust. Although none independently prove violence, together they can create emotionally unstable and psychologically dangerous domestic environments. At the same time, alternative theories continued circulating throughout the investigation. Some believed Suzanne encountered a stranger while cycling through the isolated Colorado terrain. Opportunistic offenders often target remote locations where witnesses and surveillance remain limited. However, investigators struggled to uncover convincing evidence supporting an outside predator theory. Without strong forensic support, the stranger hypothesis remained possible but psychologically fragile. As investigators examined digital evidence more closely, deeper emotional fractures inside the Morphew marriage reportedly began surfacing. Messages and private communications suggested tension hidden beneath the family's outward stability. Relationships can preserve the appearance of normality long after intimacy has collapsed internally. That emotional divide often creates resentment, isolation, and dangerous psychological instability over time. Reports later suggested Suzanne may have expressed emotional exhaustion and dissatisfaction within the marriage before her disappearance. These revelations shifted the psychological direction of the investigation significantly. Authorities no longer viewed the family only through tragedy but also through patterns of conflict, imbalance, and possible control. Emotional instability. Inside relationships often reveals itself indirectly through secrecy and manipulation. Digital evidence also exposed private emotional spaces hidden from public view. Phones, deleted messages, and online communication patterns revealed fragments of reality outsiders had never witnessed directly. Modern forensic psychology relies heavily on digital behavior because technology often captures impulses people attempt to conceal. Behind the image of domestic stability existed signs of secrecy, emotional distance, and growing relational tension. In 2021, the investigation reached a dramatic turning point when Barry Morphew was arrested in connection with Suzanne's death. Despite the absence of her body, prosecutors argued that circumstantial evidence, behavioral inconsistencies, and digital records pointed toward homicide. The arrest transformed suspicion into formal accusation, while simultaneously exposing unresolved weaknesses still surrounding the broader case and timeline. The legal process soon became increasingly complicated. In 2022, charges against Barry were dismissed without prejudice after disputes involving evidence disclosure and procedural concerns emerged during prosecution. Public reaction became sharply divided. Some interpreted the dismissal as proof of innocence, while others viewed it as a legal setback rather than exoneration. Unresolved cases often create deep psychological instability and frustration. Then came another devastating development. In 2023, Suzanne Morphew's remains were discovered in Chaffee County, Colorado, far from where she originally disappeared. The discovery confirmed her death but failed to deliver complete emotional closure. Instead, it reopened painful questions surrounding concealment, movement, motive, and hidden timelines. Sometimes truth survives not in what investigators immediately see, but in what someone desperately tried to hide. Even after years of investigation, Suzanne Morphew's case continues existing inside an uneasy space between evidence and interpretation. The discovery of her remains confirmed tragedy, but confirmation alone does not create understanding. Human beings naturally seek coherent narratives after violence. We want motives, sequences, and emotional clarity. Yet some cases resist complete explanation, forcing investigators and observers alike to confront uncertainty without emotional closure or psychological resolution. The most widely discussed theory centers on conflict within the marriage itself. Investigators and prosecutors explored the possibility that emotional deterioration inside the relationship eventually escalated into violence. Long-term resentment can evolve quietly over years, especially when control, distrust, or emotional distance becomes normalized. In many domestic cases, violence does not emerge suddenly. Instead, it develops gradually beneath ordinary routines until one irreversible moment permanently destroys the illusion of stability. Psychologically, intimate partner violence often reflects more than simple anger. It can involve fear of abandonment, damaged identity, humiliation, or the perceived collapse of control. Human beings sometimes react destructively when relationships threaten the emotional structures supporting their sense of power or self-worth. If Suzanne's disappearance resulted from domestic conflict, investigators would likely interpret concealment efforts as attempts not merely to escape punishment, but to preserve emotional dominance after irreversible damage occurred. Behavioral Analysts frequently note that offenders close to victims sometimes engage in carefully controlled post-crime behavior. They may attempt to appear cooperative while subtly shaping narratives around uncertainty and confusion. This does not always indicate guilt, yet patterns of overmanagement can attract investigative attention. When people fear losing control of perception, they sometimes focus more intensely on appearances than grief itself. Maintaining normality becomes psychologically important even as reality quietly fractures underneath them. Another theory continues haunting the Suzanne Morphew case because of the isolated terrain surrounding her disappearance. Some investigators considered whether she encountered an unknown predator during her bike ride. Remote, rural environments create opportunities for opportunistic violence where witnesses remain scarce. The randomness of stranger attacks deeply unsettles people because unpredictability destroys emotional comfort and certainty. If an unknown offender committed the crime, the disappearance suggests planning, rapid execution, or familiarity with the surrounding environment. Vanishing without immediate trace requires either extraordinary luck or understanding of terrain capable of concealing evidence effectively. Criminal psychologists recognize that opportunistic offenders often exploit isolation, timing, and vulnerability instinctively, leaving victims with little opportunity to react or escape. The absence of definitive evidence supporting either explanation trapped investigators between competing psychological narratives. One theory suggested hidden domestic collapse concealed beneath family normality. The other reflected random violence emerging from environmental vulnerability. Both possibilities exposed uncomfortable truths about fear itself. People fear loved ones because intimacy creates access. Yet strangers represent terrifying unpredictability and uncontrollable danger. So which explanation feels more believable to you? Does violence emerge more often from emotional resentment, hidden within familiar relationships, or from sudden encounters with dangerous strangers? The answer may reveal how people psychologically interpret risk. Most individuals instinctively trust familiarity, even though ordinary relationships sometimes conceal dangerous emotional instability, resentment, manipulation, or hidden patterns of control. Another disturbing question involves Suzanne's emotional state during her final moments. If she encountered someone familiar, confusion may have delayed recognition of danger entirely. Victims often struggle to identify threat accurately when violence emerges from trusted relationships because the human mind instinctively resists sudden emotional contradiction. Familiarity lowers defensive awareness and delays protective reaction during escalating situations. If the offender was unknown, however, Suzanne may never have fully understood what was happening. Sudden violence often bypasses conscious interpretation entirely. During extreme stress, the nervous system prioritizes survival reflexes rather than rational thought. Victims experience confusion, fragmented awareness, and disorientation instead of cinematic clarity. True crime narratives frequently distort this reality, oversimplifying how human beings actually experience danger. Cases like Suzanne Morphew's often force deeper reflection about justice and consequence. From an Eastern philosophical perspective, many believe every human action eventually leaves traces behind, even when legal systems fail temporarily. Harm creates imbalance, while deception carries emotional and spiritual weight. Truth may surface slowly, but hidden actions rarely disappear completely from collective memory. Western psychological perspectives focus more heavily on the hidden structure of human behavior. People possess remarkable ability to conceal emotional darkness beneath socially acceptable identities. Ordinary appearance does not guarantee empathy or emotional stability. Some individuals become highly skilled at separating harmful impulses from public behavior, allowing destructive tendencies to remain hidden beneath politeness and carefully maintained routines. Perhaps that is why unresolved criminal cases remain so powerful within public consciousness. They expose how limited human understanding truly is. Investigators examine evidence while psychologists study behavioral patterns, yet no method fully reveals another person's internal world. When uncertainty survives for years, society begins projecting fear, personal belief, and emotional meaning directly onto silence itself. Suzanne Morphew's case eventually became more than a disappearance investigation. It evolved into a reflection of hidden emotional tension inside ordinary lives. Behind photographs, routines, and familiar environments, unseen fractures may already exist quietly. Most never lead to violence, but some do. Psychological deterioration often remains invisible until irreversible harm has already occurred and opportunities for prevention disappear. Even now, major questions surrounding the investigation remain unresolved. Legal uncertainty continues, while public debate persists regarding motive, evidence, and interpretation. Yet one truth remains undeniable regardless of future developments. Suzanne Morphew was a real human being whose absence permanently altered the emotional lives of those connected to her. Beyond headlines exists grief that never fully disappears. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case is how silence itself became evidence. Silence within relationships. Silence across empty roads and mountain forests. Silence inside missing digital records. Human beings often fear visible violence. Yet silence can feel even more disturbing because imagination begins filling spaces reality refuses to explain. The unknown sometimes leaves wounds deeper than certainty ever could. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions. And some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.